All right, so before we begin, if someone can just give us a brief synopsis of chapter 1 and chapter 2 in under a minute. Who wants to take a stab at it?
Chapter 1. So, in chapter 1, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, they leave Bethlehem and go to Moab, and their sons marry Ruth and Oprah, but they leave the land of bread pretty much to go there, but shortly lived, Elimelech dies, and so does their two sons, forgot their names. And from there, Naomi has a decision whether to stay or go back, and she chooses to go back. Ruth follows her, but then her other daughter-in-law, Orpah, does not follow her. But in the process of going back, her heart turns she becomes bitter. So when she does eventually go back and she sees the people, she asks them to call her Mara, which means bitterness. But also in that time in Ruth's life, God is working in her, and we're getting to see the beginning of a redeemer and the need for a redeemer, being that she was following other gods as a Moabite woman. And then we start to see favor in her when she finds the farm, whatever, of Boaz, not knowing who it is, but God shows favor upon her when she's able to glean. And I remember 2 studies ago you explained the gleaning was really painful, these sharp scraps that were really tiny, having to pick up, so she was always on her knees and stuff like that. But also just her, sticking by Naomi. So also seeing that faithfulness of the Lord in her, Naomi. And I think that's where we're at.
Yeah, that's a good summary. So I think the book presents essentially 2 problems that occur, which is in the book of in chapter 1, what we see is as Rose just explained. Naomi loses her husband, and so does Ruth. She loses her husband. So there's a lack of there's a lack of family, and they're in need of family. They're in need of someone to come and redeem them, and that is one of the problems. That's more of the longer term problem that we see in the book of Ruth. And the immediate problem, obviously, is the lack of food. Right? They leave. They decide to go back to Jerusalem, and although there is food and the Lord has blessed Bethlehem, although the Lord has blessed Bethlehem, there are 2 widow women, and as we know, back then it was for the men to provide. It was the duty of the men to provide, and these are 2 widowed women who need to fend for themselves. And the struggle is that one of them is a Moabite woman. She's not. And the other struggle is that Naomi is an older woman. So the Moabite, the younger woman, Ruth, has to fend for both of them. And so what we're seeing as we go through the book of Ruth is God providing these 2 means. He's resolving these 2 things that they need. So I'll do a recap from our last study. So last study we were in chapter 3, and what we saw is we saw Naomi's plan for Ruth. So from verses 1 through 5 in chapter 3, what we see is Naomi sets up this plan, right? In chapter 2, Ruth was fending for Naomi, right? She went out to the fields. She went to go gather barley and harvest and wheat. She went to go gather that for both of them. And she's kind of fending for both of them. And now what we see is kind of Naomi switching roles with Ruth, right? She says, "My daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you?" Right? So after all that Ruth has done for Naomi, now it's Naomi's turn to kind of look after Ruth. And she does so by setting up this plan or this plot to go and meet Boaz so that Boaz might take notice of her, right? And eventually her desire is that Boaz would take her into marriage. And Naomi's end goal or desire is that it would be well with Ruth, right? And then in verse 2, Naomi continues to kind of state what was already evident, right? She says that Boaz is within the relative line, And Naomi kind of knows the lay of the land. She knows the law of the land. And she uses this to kind of concatenate or come up with a plan for Ruth. Right? She knows that it's harvest season. It was almost done, and she knew where Boaz was, right? During this time, she knew that he would be winnowing the harvests, and so she sets up this plot. And then in verses 3-5, Naomi plans. She sets up this plan. She says, "Get ready, apply perfume, and make your way over to him." Essentially, get yourself all prettied up so that you could, express your interest to Boaz, right? And we had said that this was a bold plan. And why was it? Does anyone remember why this was a bold plan? So she was going to Boaz in the field at nighttime. Right. So women that came up during the times where the men were winnowing barley, or when they were on the threshing floor, it would be prostitutes that would come and offer themselves up to these men because they would sleep there, to kind of protect their harvest. So she could have easily been mistaken as coming over as a prostitute, and this is the reason why Naomi tells Ruth, do it in secret, and wait until he's done harvesting. So it's kind of, they don't know how it's going to end, but she sets up this bold plan. And what do we see from Ruth? We see that Ruth obeys, right? She goes. She doesn't question Naomi. She just goes. She honors her mother-in-law, right? We've spoken about her commitment to Naomi, and we just continue to see this commitment to Naomi from Ruth. And then in verses 6 through, and we ended at verse 15 last time, verses 6 through 15, we see Ruth's proposal to Boaz. Essentially, she's proposing to him. She's asking that he would marry her, right? Verses 6 and 7, we see Ruth is being a woman of her word. She follows through with the advice that she receives from Naomi. She goes to Boaz. And then verses 8 and 9, Boaz kind of wakes up. He's startled. He sees a woman at his feet. And we kind of spoke of the interaction that they had when he wakes up and sees Ruth there at his feet, right? We had spoken that we kind of like focus in on how they address themselves, right? She identifies herself as a maid, a term of humility, but a chapter ago she addressed herself as a foreigner. So her confidence with Boaz is kind of increasing. She wouldn't have considered herself a maid just a chapter ago, but now she does. And then we see Boaz addresses Ruth as a sister, right? So he had an honor for her. He respected her, and we kind of went into how, like, this is a picture of us, right? And of us needing to understand how God sees us. So the more we see how God sees us, the more likely we are to approach Him and approach Him with confidence, but also with reverence, right? And we spoke on how God sees us as children, right? He doesn't see us simply as men that are dead in sin anymore. He sees us as children that are His, that He has redeemed, and that is what should give us confidence to, and that is the way that we ought to approach God. And this is what we're seeing in between Boaz and Ruth. Ruth is starting to gain this confidence with Boaz because he has been kind to her, and because they're developing, and she's starting to understand how Boaz sees her. So verse 10, we see Boaz's response to her plea, which is she should be blessed. She's been kind, and she's been kinder than she was initially. So he just asks that she be blessed. And then he says, you don't even go for a young man, right? In verse 10, he says, but better than the first by not going after young men, whether poor or rich, right? So essentially, she, it would have been natural instinct for her to go with someone her age. It would have been easier for her to go with someone her age, but what we're seeing here is Ruth is adopting the customs of Naomi and Naomi's family, and the custom was to be redeemed by the kinsman, right?
Benito,
Yes.
I have a random question. Being that early in a few verses you said she went to him, like kind of proposing. Thinking of the culture today, where it's typically the guy, but also even in the Old Testament, where the guy would have gone to the father and asked for, the daughter and stuff. Was that considered just also boldness, or even culture, being that she went to him?
I think it was boldness, and I think it was. I mean, she was listening to Naomi's advice, and obviously they both knew the situation that they were in. Like they couldn't just wait around.
Okay.
So they took the initiative to make sure that they were securing a husband for Ruth.
Okay.
Yeah.
Also, I believe I listened to something recently that said that there were allowances in the Mosaic law for women to propose for marriage when they're for a redeemer, like in this situation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and in the same way, it's almost like this is not even like a case where it's like, will you marry me? So there was a possibility that Ruth would not marry Boaz had the Redeemer, who was supposed to marry her, bought the house. So in a sense, it was a leap of faith. It wasn't like a, will you marry me in that right? But according to the Mosaic law, this was allowed,
Yeah, I mean, she is showing interest and she's letting it be known. But, this was a leap of faith on behalf of Naomi.
Mm-hmm.
On behalf of Naomi for one, setting up this plot, but on behalf of Ruth for actually following through. So Boaz says he's going to fulfill this request, and obviously it shows that he has interest in her. And though Boaz is more than willing, we see in verses 12 and 13, and when we've seen it in chapter 2, Boaz is a nobleman, right? He's a man of integrity. He knows that he's not the nearest kinsman redeemer, and so he essentially makes it plain that there's an order to these things. And being that he's not the nearest kinsman, he's going to make sure that she's redeemed by the nearest kinsman. And if he doesn't want her, then he will redeem her. But he essentially is saying, I'm going to make sure you're redeemed. And then he tells her not to tell anyone, because obviously this could be perceived as something negative. A woman coming to you in the night. And this is why he says, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And then he sends her off with food. So then we kind of pick up where we left off last time. So we're going to read from verses 16 through verses 12 of chapter 4. So someone wants to read it loud and clear?
16 through 18?
16 through 12.
Okay, the next chapter.
Yeah.
You gonna read it, Mark?
Oh, yeah. I'm reading from the ESV. And when she came to her mother-in-law, 3:12, right? So 4:16?
3:16.
3:16 to 4:12?
Yeah.
And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, how did you fare, my daughter? Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. She replied, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate, and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, turn aside, friend, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city, and said, sit down here. So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not tell me, that I may know, for there is no one beside you to redeem it, and I come after you. And he said, I will redeem it. Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman.
Amen. All right, so we continue on verse 16. Essentially, we're seeing the same kind of structure as chapter 2. I mentioned this last time. We start off with Naomi and Ruth. They have a conversation, and then it's an interaction between Ruth and Boaz, and then Ruth goes back to kind of report into Naomi to let them know about their interaction and bring the food back. Same thing we see in chapter 2, we're seeing in chapter 3. So in verse 16, she's going back to Ruth, right? And you could, before we even get there, just imagine like what the scene is like between Ruth and Boaz, right? She kind of just like showed her interest in Boaz, and he's obviously interested, but then he says, wait, there's someone closer to me. And then they have to kind of wait until he goes and finds that nearest kinsman and find out if he's going to redeem her or not. So you could just imagine like what they're going through in their minds. Like they obviously they're attracted to one another. They're showing interest in one another, and now they don't know if they will even end up with one another. So for Ruth, her desire was Boaz, and she didn't know if she was going to end up with Boaz. And for Boaz was, I don't know if the nearest kinsman redeemer is actually going to redeem her. So like this is going through their minds. So there's a sense of uncertainty on both sides of the part, on both sides, right? And just to go to sleep would probably be like a difficult thing. It's kind of like something important that you're waiting on, news that you're waiting on, and you don't know the answer to it. Like it's gonna be something that's constant on your mind, and so it was with them. And now we come to Naomi, and she also must have been like in great. She also must have had like great anticipation, right? She sends off Ruth. She tells Ruth, "Hey, go do these things. Go meet up with Boaz." And she kind of doesn't hear anything back until Ruth comes back, right? So she also must be patient and must be waiting to kind of hear back what the response is and what the reaction was of Boaz. So the one who set up the whole plan is probably herself kind of wondering and anticipating what's going on with her daughter-in-law. Is she okay? Did Boaz take her as a prostitute like others who go to the threshing floor would have been taken as? So you could just imagine all of the things that are going on in Naomi's mind. So this required patience on behalf of Naomi, and it required patience on behalf of Boaz and Ruth. And what we're seeing is throughout the book is start off, with Naomi starts off seeing herself as bitter, and she seems like distant toward God, and we see kind of her faith heightening and her trust in the Lord heightening. Right, the simple fact that she made this plan for Ruth is an indication that she trusted in God. The reality that she had to wait on the Lord patiently for Ruth to come back and find out what happened, it's showing that her faith is being increased, right? In this situation, all that was left for her to do is pray, right, and wait. She could do nothing else, right? The situation was in God's hands, and just like Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz, they're kind of all stripped of self, right? There's nothing they could do. The only thing that Boaz could do is go to the kinsman redeemer. But essentially, it's in the Lord's hand what's going to happen, who Ruth is going to end up with. And the question that we have to ask ourselves, is this true in our walk, right? When there's big decisions, when there's things that we're waiting on, are we waiting patiently? Are we trusting in the Lord? Are we waiting on the Lord? Are you okay with just praying and leaving it in God's hands? Or are you gonna be anxious the whole time, be worrying, thinking about all the different outcomes, when none of that can really happen? Like none of the different outcomes that play in your head can help out the situation. So is this true in your life? And I pray that we would grow in this area, because I know for me, like, when I'm stressed or when I'm unsure, when there's uncertainty, I tend to stress, But what this is showing us is that we have to leave it in God's hands. We have to trust in God, and in God's sovereignty. You want to say something? No? Okay. And so the first question we see from Naomi is, how did it go? How did you fare, my daughter? Like the ESV says. KJV says, who art thou, my daughter? And the KJV is a little confusing, but I think essentially the ESV and the NASB and more the modern translations translate it a little bit better to understand. She's essentially just asking, how did it go, right? She's not asking her, who are you? She's asking her, how did it go? She wants to know everything that happened. She wants to know the encounter that Ruth had with Boaz. And of course, what we're seeing is a great concern on behalf of Naomi for Ruth. Right? She just wants Ruth to be well off. And this is the reason why she's set up the plot. And now she just wants to check in and make sure that all went well. And so we move on to verse 17. And it says, she said, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said, do not go to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Right? So she wants to know how it went with her and Boaz. And Ruth kind of doesn't give her all the details. Right? There was a lot that went on in chapter 3. And all she says is, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me. Like, she puts emphasis on what he has given to her, which means, like, we should be focusing on the 6 measures of barley, and the reason why she does this is because obviously they're both in awe, right? The first time that Ruth met with Boaz, he sent her away. What did he give her? Barley, right? He gave her, it was between 30 to 50 pounds of barley. And now he sends her back, and most people think this is around 60, 70 pounds of barley, right? So it's more than sufficient for them. It was more than he sent her off the first time. And so we continue to see that Boaz, he never allows Ruth to to leave empty-handed, right? He continues to be kind. He continues to be generous to her, which is a great indicator of his intentions for Ruth, right? He's obviously showing interest. And this is kind of where Ruth is getting her confidence. By all his kind acts, by all his goodness toward her, this is where she's getting her confidence to approach Boaz. And then she repeats, and this is important, she repeats what he said when he gave her the barley. He said, "Go not empty unto thy mother-in-law," right? It doesn't say it in the previous verse when he gave it to her, but it does say it here. And this is beautiful, because what we're seeing here is we see the same word empty in verse in chapter 1, verse 21. Can someone read it?
I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?
Right, so when Naomi was going through trials, I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. And he's saying, go not empty onto thy, don't go empty back to your mother-in-law, So this is kind of, essentially, the scripture is drawing out that Naomi's empty days are over, right? Like, if we haven't seen it in chapter 2, he's kind of showing this. And when we feel empty, right, we feel like God has left us, like God has abandoned us. And we ought not to be driven by how we feel, right? Or our emotions, like simply our emotions. Yes, our emotions are a great indicator, and how we feel is a great indicator of things. But if we're simply driven by our emotions and not by the truths of God and the promises of God, then we're going to be very rocky, right? We're going to be like the stock market, where it's like just jumping up and down. And we're going to be, as James says, tossed to and fro if we're driven by just our feelings. What we ought to be doing is we ought to be driven by the truths of God and the promises of God and the Word of God. Yeah. Yes.
That's a great connection. The empty. She went out and then he's saying, don't return to your mother. That same word, because it shows God's faithfulness. And now it's this time point. So that's great. I never saw that. I read this book so many times.
So we continue on to verse 18. It says, "Then she said, 'Wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest until he has settled it today.'" So Naomi's advice is kind of opposite than what she initially started, right? She started off the chapter, go do this, like get ready and go meet Boaz, right? Go wash, anoint yourself, put on clothes, go down to the threshing floor, watch where Boaz lies down, approach him, uncover his legs. And then now she tells her, you kind of done your part here. There's nothing else you could do. Just sit down, wait, and see what happens, right? And this is the reality. Like, we ought to be putting feet to our prayers, but there comes a time where, we just have to sit and wait on the Lord, and just leave it in God's hands. And this is what Naomi is telling Ruth to do. Just leave it in Boaz's hands. He said he's going to. He's not going to. She knows that he's not going to rest until Boaz finds a redeemer for her. So there's no need for Ruth to do anything further, right? It's going to turn out the way that it turns out. And we kind of see that Naomi has, a sense of knowledge, or like she through Boaz's actions, she kind of already sees his character and trusts that he's going to be a man of his word. She knows that he's a noble man, a man of integrity. And so what he says he will do, he will do. And obviously it's not simply in Boaz's hands. Yes, he's going to go and find a redeemer, but like I said, this is ultimately in God's hands, and who is going to be her redeemer, right? So I have a question. Can you guys think of a situation where you had to wait with a lot of anticipation on the Lord, and what was your attitude toward it? Big decisions in your life. You had to wait on the Lord. What was your attitude like?
Some days you're good, other days you're fretting and up and down.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, like I when I was working at my current job, I really didn't like it, and I wanted to leave, and I was praying, God, what should I do? And I wanted to get another job. I was looking for another job, but I didn't just want to leave it. And so I was waiting on God and praying and just waiting to see what happened. And after a while, I just said, let me just stick it out for a while. And then I started getting promoted, and I said, oh, okay, I like it. I'm going to stay. But at the time, usually in the past, I would have just been, I'm leaving. I'm done. I'm going to quit. I'm going to go get something else, find the next job because I just don't like it. But I kind of waited. And the answer was to wait. To stay where I was.
Yeah.
And then he made the changes that were necessary without me having to do anything.
Yeah.
It's not really something I see here, because I've seen this in even my own life. It's like where Naomi tells Ruth to like wait and see how the matter turns out. And it's one of those things where it's like she has no control over the elders or the kinsman redeemer or Boaz. Like there's no control over that. And I see that like even for like in my life where God is like saying wait, and I keep trying to like force something to happen, but like just wait, and like things will happen, and all of a sudden he'll kind of bring that answer prayer to you. Like he'll bring that answer to you, like using, moving all these pieces, whether it be people, things, circumstance. Yeah. But I didn't give an example because I'm not gonna give an example. I'm gonna hide that. I'm gonna keep that to myself. But it's just good.
Thank you for sharing with me.
Thank you for telling me.
Well, I can give an example, but even like you said, like she had to trust in the promises of the Lord and everything like that and waiting. So I know for me, when I'm still going through it, so I lost my insurance. And like for most people know, like I see doctors very regularly and I need insurance. But then it was kind of like back in December, like what do I do? Like how am I going to afford it? And like just the magnitude of the cost, it's going to be a chunk of my paycheck. And I was just like worried, kind of like Denise at first was just like worried, being anxious. But even the Lord just reminded me like his promises, being faithful. Like obviously God knows my medical condition and just the cost of it. But even in the waiting, he gives hope, like in the sense of like with Ruth just now, when Boaz says, well, there's a near kinsman, I'm going to make sure you're redeemed in something, even though she doesn't know what the ending is for herself. Even for me, it was like there was an insurance that said they'll cover. I still don't know because I have to wait till March 1st what's going to happen. I'm either going to have a $900 bill or we'll see. But it's still just like, all right, I have to remember the promise of the Lord, and God is faithful in doing that. So like in that waiting season, not to fret.
Yeah. Yep.
Some of the vein, like what you're saying, that the hope, that God gives hope in between. Like, you don't get the full picture, but it's like it gives you something to hold on to. And it's like what you see with Ruth, that this was also in a sermon I was listening to on Ruth, but it was highlighted that when Naomi initially told her to go, she didn't give her like step by step as far as like what to do after. Like she gave her certain steps, but then it was like, at the point where they actually interacted, she didn't know what she was supposed to say, what to do. And it's like, the Lord gives us up until a certain point, so that we have to continue to rely on him.
Yeah.
I think the beauty of it is that hope that we have in God in those situations. Like through those situations, he's teaching us to hope in him. And it's the same way here. Naomi shows this trust that Boaz is going to do what he says he would do. You know, that he's going to settle it. Like you said, he's a man of integrity. And it's the same way that we have to trust that God's going to do what he says he does. When we're going through these afflictions, we have to trust that he's working all these things for our good, for our salvation, you know. Even if it's not easy at the moment, you know, it's not easy to wait. It's not easy to struggle, and it's not easy to be afflicted, you know. But that hope, God gives us hope through those struggles, and that's the end of what we're going through. You know, that's the end, to believe in God. You know.
It's funny. I think that's when you can really say the joy of the Lord is my strength. When you're going through those times.
Yeah. I mean, perfect example is, and we spoke about this. The first study is Elimelech, right? He was in need of food. What did he do? He kind of put it into his own hands. He moved to a idolatrous nation, and he ended up not dying of starvation. But he ended up dying. You know, he got the food, but he died. You know, and his kids died, and his kids married Moabite women. So he put it into his own hands instead of trusting in the Lord. And that's what we do many of the times. We put it in our own hands. You know, we think of all the different alternatives, all the different possibilities. You know, we prepare as much as we can, and we leave no room for God, for us to like just place our faith in God. You know, and prayer is like the last thing we do if we pray at all. You know, but the reality is that the first thing we ought to do is go to the Word, seek out those promises, reaffirm those promises, let that be at the forefront of our mind, and pray that the Lord would just help us. And many times He does help us, and it's a beautiful thing. So
Johnny.
Yeah.
And as my great-grandmother always did talk about the Word of God, you have to read. You have to spend time in the Scriptures.
Right.
And as we're seeing how these people are reacting to each other, this is where we get our. But we have to we have to talk with Him, and then there's the Scripture. That's the record. Mm-hmm. That's the record. That's the written. You can't dispute with. This is human life that's moving forward.
Amen.
And it's wonderful to see God at work.
Amen.
And to watch the movement of this. But as I was his age, listening, that's what's so important.
Amen. I mean, we need to have the Word of God in us and reading it so that we know the promises. Another thing to note is that Naomi is the one that gives counsel to Ruth, right? Like, a lot of times we need to hear it from other brothers and sisters. Just wait. Like, a lot of times you're so blinded by your emotions or all the different alternatives and outcomes that you need another brother or sister just to come and tell you, hey, like, just trust in the Lord, brother, and you know, remind you of a promise, remind you how good God is. So we move on to chapter 4, and we'll be focusing on verses 1 through 12 if we get to finish. If not, we'll finish it next time. I think next time we'll be done with the book of Ruth. So Ruth is redeemed in verses 1 through 12, and then we see kind of marriage and family in verses 13 to 17. And then 18 to 22, we see the genealogy of David. So, first thing we see kind of transpiring in chapter 4 is kind of this legal setting of a court, right? And there's a transaction between Boaz and the nearest kinsman. And then we kind of see, you know, the fruit of it in the following verses. So, from chapter 3 to chapter 4, what we're seeing here is like a shift. It was kind of focusing on Ruth and Naomi, and now it's kind of focusing on Boaz, and the emphasis is placed on Boaz and his actions and his attempt to redeem Ruth. So we start in verse 1. It says, "Now Boaz went up to the gate, sat down there, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. So he said, 'Turn aside, friend, sit down here.' And he turned aside and sat down. he took that's verse 1. Right? So immediately what we see is Boaz goes to the gate to find a resolution, right? To the problem at hand, right? She needs a redeemer, he wants to go find. And the first thing he had to do was he had to go to the gate. And what was the significance of going to the gate? Anyone know?
That's where all the business happened, right?
Yes.
Center of the city.
Exactly. So think of it like a funnel. Obviously you have the tip where everything. It would be like everyone entering in through the narrow, and then you have the whole city. It was where you were going to encounter everyone coming in and out, right? And this was the best place for Boaz to find the nearest kinsman, and that's why he goes there. The gate of the gate was the center of the city. It was the place where important assemblies happened. We find kings of Israel and of Judah sitting on thrones in an open place, and like Rose says, this was primarily where it was a place for legal business, right? To show you an example of this, someone want to read 1 Kings 22:10?
1 Kings
22:10.
Now the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, were sitting each on his throne, arrayed in their robes, at the threshing floor at the entrance of the gate of Samaria, and all the prophets were prophesying before them.
Right. So this is where even a lot of the elders would come, and they would make determinations. If someone was fleeing from their city, the elders would be at the gate to kind of assess and determine if he should be allowed, based on of why he was fleeing from his country. So specifically, the gate was also used in situations where we find Ruth in, right, where she needed to be redeemed. They would do this at the gate, right? They would do this in the eye of the public, amongst the elders. And this is the reason why, it says he calls elders to come. Verse 1 says that he notices the kinsman, he calls him over, and he didn't know that he was going to be there, but he knew that was the best place to go, so he went to wait there. It's kind of like what we see in chapter 2, where Ruth stumbles across Boaz. So he stumbles across the nearer kinsman. It's kind of like when we were growing up, when we were growing up and we didn't have cell phones, or we weren't using cell phones as much, we would just go to the park, right? And you would know, like I know, like growing up, I would go and play basketball, and I knew my friends would be at the park. If I wanted to find them, I just went to the park, and that's where I would find them. And so he goes to the gate, and he's going to go and find, the nearer kinsman. It says he took yes.
It's like when we go evangelize, we go where the train is, we know where we're going to come from.
Yeah. No text to let you know if they were canceling evangelism or any of that.
Had to show up.
They just went. And then he says he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down." So they sat down. Obviously, elders exercise judicial functions. Like I said, an example, if a man fled from the avenger of blood, they would be the ones that would determine it. Joshua 24 says, "He shall flee to one of these cities, and shall stand at the entrance of the gate of the city, and state his case in the hearing of the elders of the city, and they shall take him into the city to them, and give him a place so that he may dwell among them." Right? So they were kind of the gatekeepers of the city. So elders were they possess, authority. In this case, what what Boaz is doing is he's calling these elders to sit down as witnesses, right? And whenever you had elders sitting down, then you had other people gathering around because they knew that there was something going on. So you have the elders sitting down. He sees the nearer kinsman, and they begin kind of the process of redemption for Ruth and Naomi. A commentator put it this way: he's speaking of the elders. Their importance was such that any transaction attested by them was of unimpeachable validity, right? So they were, if it came from the elders, it was valid. Like it was something that they can trust in. If they were the witnesses of a transaction, and so he calls them over, and they sit down. And then we move on to verses 3 and 4. It says, "Then he said to the closest relative, 'Naomi, who has come back from the land of Moab, has to sell the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech.'" Right? So essentially, he's letting, he's presenting the case, right? He's presenting the issue at hand. He's letting this guy know, you're the nearer kinsman redeemer. And he's giving him the opportunity to redeem, because this was the law for him to do, right? He was to fulfill this. Of course, this land was for Naomi from their brother Elimelech, right? So they're somehow related to Elimelech. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're actual like brothers, but they could have also been like a close family member to Elimelech, and it would be their duty to.
Probably cousins.
Yeah, they could have been cousins. Because if they were a little bit closer, Boaz probably would have addressed them by name, but he doesn't address them by name, which indicates that it could have been, a family member that was not immediate family, but they were a family member. So we went through Deuteronomy last time, but we didn't go through Leviticus. If someone could read Leviticus 25, verses 23 to 28. Leviticus 25, 23 to 28.
The land shall not be sold in perpetuity. The land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me. And in all the country you possess, you shall allow a redemption of the land. If your brother becomes poor and sells part of his property, then his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his brother has sold. If a man has no one to redeem it, and then himself becomes prosperous and finds sufficient means to redeem it, let him calculate the years since he sold it, and pay back the balance to the man to whom he sold it, and then return to his property. But if he has not sufficient means to recover it, then what he sold shall remain in the land of the buyer until the year of Jubilee. In the Jubilee it shall be released, and he shall return to his property.
All right, so essentially what Boaz is doing is he's presenting this, and the nearer kinsman redeemer knows that this is what he's doing. He's presenting him the option to buy over this land that was Elimelech's, which belongs to Naomi, and so this is what he thinks he's doing, and he is doing this. And the man replies, "Yes, I'll take it. Yes, indeed." Right? In fact, he's in his mind, he's like, "Give me 2 of those." Right? So he says, "I will redeem it." And these probably weren't the words that Boaz wanted to hear. Right? That means if he would redeem it, he would also redeem Ruth. And this is not what he wanted to hear. But because obviously this man is only interested in the land, as we're going to see. But Boaz is more interested in Ruth and redeeming Ruth. Yeah.
When you said that, he probably didn't want to hear that. Isn't it more like he's tricking like him in a way? Like he hasn't thrown the whole thing to him.
Yeah, so that's what he's doing. I mean, he's presenting in a good place. I mean, he's kind of bringing over this opportunity that seems so good, and the guy just goes in. He says, "Yes, I'll take it. Yeah, give me more property. Like, if you want to grow my property, then I'll be more than willing to." But I mean, Boaz still doesn't know if his whole like plan and plot is gonna work, but he's trying it out. So he's presenting, the good, or what he believes is the good for this man. Obviously, for Boaz, what's the best part of this whole redeeming is Ruth. So then he kind of hits him with the condition, right? Or what else he has to redeem. He says, then Boaz says, on the day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance. Right? So he presents the land, but then he also says you must acquire Naomi and the Moabitess Ruth. And to acquire Ruth would mean that he would have to perform his duty and produce an heir, right? And this heir that would be born from Ruth would take over the land that he purchased. So he's starting to get the real deal here, of the real transaction, the real opportunity that he decides, I don't want that. I don't want to take over Ruth. It could be that he didn't want to pay for something that eventually would be given over to an heir of Ruth. It could be that she was a Moabitess, and he didn't want anything to do with a Moabite, and so he refrains, right? He refrains from the duty of taking up Ruth and taking the land. He says in verse 6, the closest relative says, I cannot redeem it for myself because I would jeopardize my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourself. You may have my right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it. So the presentation, the way that he presents it to this guy, Boaz, it ends up turning out as he expected, right? And now he's going to be able to redeem the field and redeem Ruth. And do you guys think that the nearer kinsman was wrong in denying the opportunity to redeem the land and Ruth?
Wrong in what sense?
Sin?
Yeah. Was he in sin, or was he wrong? Do you think that his decision to deny was wrong?
No.
He's silly, but yeah, he didn't know.
Well, I don't think so, because there's another option. I think it'd be wrong if there was no other option and he was still letting the name die. But the guy's saying, I would do it.
So, okay. Let's turn to Deuteronomy 25, 9, and 10. 'Cause we read this last time.
And isn't it also just selfish? Because like he was all for it until he realized he had to get the Moabite woman. So it was out of greed. He just wanted the land.
Maybe honoring his first wife.
Yeah, because he doesn't he have to like throw away his own name? Not throw away, but like take care of that family and in his sibling or relative's name. Like
25, 9, and 10.
Yeah.
25, 9, 10.
It says then 25, 9, and 10.
Deuteronomy 9 and 10.
25, 9, and 10.
25, 9 and 10. Sorry.
Then, to make sure. Then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, and pull his sandal off his foot, and spit in his face. And she shall answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And the name of his house shall be called in Israel, the house of him who had his sandal pulled off.
Right, so Deuteronomy 25 is obviously speaking of like the process of a kinsman redeemer, right? And those two verses is if that person does not redeem, his relatives, land and wife, and like Rose says, I mean it doesn't say for certain, but what we do know and what we do see from the scriptures is that he was willing. He was willing initially, right? When it was just the land, he was willing. But as soon as you say that you have to redeem Ruth, the Moabite, he says, nah, never mind. I don't want it. You can take the land. So, in a sense, like I said, the scripture doesn't say it. In a sense, it does seem like it's because of greed, because he's going to have to give the land that to the heir of that Ruth gives birth to if he decides to redeem her. Yeah.
Could it also be like prudence for like the nation of Israel in a sense of allowing a Moabitess, kind of like not approving of that Moabitess being grafted into Israel almost? It's like a
it could be that also, and I think that's why that's why Boaz separates like the land, and then he separates
the
Moabitess, and it's kind of like putting it in Boaz. The nearer redeemer, the near kinsman, putting in his face that you have to also take this Moabite. Yeah.
So I have a question in regards to how Boaz could have been, like the reasoning as to why Boaz was okay with her being a Moabitess. Was it because she was already part of the family? Like, and I know that he witnessed her faithfulness to Naomi and all that stuff, but like, is that, could it have been because she was already, I guess, so to speak, in the bloodline? Not the bloodline, but, do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I understand. I can't answer that question with certainty, and I don't know that the scriptures would give an answer, but I would say yes. But also, she's demonstrating, faith in God,
Yeah.
and her characteristics are demonstrating that she's willing to take on the customs. She's seeing. I mean, he's seeing her kindness toward Naomi and how she's treated Naomi, and how she's following the God of Israel.
She's really godly. She's a godly woman.
She's a godly woman, and which is what he says. What he makes mention of. She's a noble woman. So can't say for sure, but that would be what I would say in regards to that.
But saying that she's a Moabite is not like a religion, is it? It's just that she's from the country, Moab, right?
Yeah.
When she went with Naomi,
You were supposed to mix.
in her abandonment of like not staying the way her sister stood, right? Wouldn't it already say that she was like a sort of a believer now?
Yeah, I mean, she's showing all indication of a believer. She's showing all indication that she's following God. And she's sacrificed a lot even just to come with Naomi. So it's like when you're like courting and you're trying to see if someone is a believer and they're showing all these signs like of a believer. Like if they're demonstrating a lot of signs of being a believer, you're gonna be okay with that. And so I think that's the case with Boaz. I mean, really, what's attracting him is her faith and is her character, and so that's what we see. So he says, so he's able to redeem her, because this guy doesn't want to redeem her. He's the nearer kinsman sees it as kind of, if he does it, he's going to have to shrink his property. Eventually, he's gonna shrink his property, and he's gonna invest money into this property, and he's also gonna have to take care of Ruth, as a family member.
Okay.
Yes.
And also the selfishness, because the child that she will have, he's not even born yet, and it's going to take many years before he's old enough to take it over.
Yeah.
I mean, what's the chances of him still being around by the time he's old enough to take over the land?
Yeah.
But he's just looking at the dollar sign, the money, the land. I don't want to give it up. But he's not being practical about it.
Yeah. Yeah, and he wants to preserve it for his heir, right? So we kind of see a difference between what Deuteronomy 25 calls a woman to do if she's rejected, and how kind of Boaz treats the situation, right? He doesn't spit in his face. He doesn't do any of that. He's willing because he wants Ruth, you know. So he just kind of goes along with it. We read in verses 7 and 8. Now this was the custom in the former times in Israel concerning the redemption and exchange of land to confirm any matter. A man removed his sandal and gave it to another, and this was the manner of attestation in Israel. So the narrator brings us to understand this custom. We've kind of already read in Deuteronomy 5 what the custom was concerning redeeming a family, or redeeming a family member. And we see kind of that it's very different. You know, it says in verse 8, so the closest relative said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, and he removed his sandal and he gives it over. So kind of what he's doing is he's agreeing, and he's making a declaration to Boaz, you know, you can have the land, and you can have the Moabite woman, right? And we have the witnesses of the elders there, and anyone else that's gathered around, and we see that in the other verses that there are people gathered around, and they're taking witness of this interaction between Boaz and the kinsman. So it's sealed now. It's sealed, and he's going to redeem Ruth and Naomi and Naomi's land. So then we kind of go into verses 9 through 12. And Boaz essentially is giving a speech here. And he's kind of directing those who are witnesses, all those people in the crowd, and he addresses the elders, but then he also addresses all the people there. And essentially what he's doing is he's making sure not only are the elders witnesses to the transaction that just took place, but all the people that were there, they have made mention, they have taken notice of this transaction, right? And Boaz is feeling comforted by the fact that other people have witnessed this transaction. It is established, and I'm sure he is excited to kind of go and redeem Ruth. So in buying the field, he also obtains Ruth, the Moabitess, and it says here, it says in verse 11, all the people who are in the court and the elder says, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel, and may you achieve the wealth and Epaphras and become famous in Bethlehem. So the first thing that they do is they recognize the transaction, and they recognize that it came from the Lord, right? It says, may the Lord make the woman. So they understand that this blessing of redemption is coming from the Lord, and they desire it to be just like Rachel and Leah, right? So what we're seeing, and what we've seen, is a progression from this Moabite foreigner, you know, meeting Boaz, seeing herself as a foreigner, and then in chapter 3 she sees herself as a maid, and now she's going to be one that will build the house of Israel like Rachel and Leah. So we're seeing this progression of redemption in Ruth's life. And then it says, moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, who Tamar bore to Judah through the offspring, which the Lord will give you by this young woman. And I'll save this for next time, verses kind of like 11, 12, and then the rest of the verses. What I really want to focus is on, obviously this is a picture of redemption in believers. And I I want to focus on the redemption that we see in the book of Ruth and in the redemption that we see in our lives as believers, in certain examples of redemption. So do you guys have any questions about these verses? Yeah.
It's kind of an odd question, but
Or a comment?
So though, because people kind of say that this is like a very complete picture of the gospel. So if there is if does the kinsman redeemer symbolize something in regards to our salvation? Not so much Boaz, but the other one, the one that kind of was like, nah, I don't. Is there like, does he symbolize something in the salvation of us?
So every person in the book of Ruth symbolizes something. It's every person in the book of Ruth is. I don't know about the nearer kinsman redeemer. I would say Boaz, Ruth, and Naomi all have characteristics that demonstrate characteristics of God. And that's what we're seeing, primarily Boaz. Obviously, Boaz is not God completely. Like, it's not like, I would never say that he's God. He's the picture of God. But it is a shadow of God redeeming his people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In Matthew Henry's commentary, he was speaking about how the kinsman, the first one, is a picture of the law, which couldn't redeem us. And how Boaz is the Christ, which can redeem us. So how the law came first, the law of Moses came first, but it couldn't redeem anybody. It only convicts us of our sin. And I think that was a really good point, and that makes complete sense if you really think about it.
Yeah.
Also, a note on Boaz that like after we were talking about how it was clear that Ruth was a believer and all that stuff. It made me think. I don't know if this is like biblically accurate, but it makes me think that that speaks volumes about his own faith. That he was. It made me think, like, for example, of Isaac when he had to sacrifice his son. Like how it says that he believed that even that he could even raise his son from the dead. And so, like, for Boaz to have faith that she would be grafted in, being a foreigner, like, I don't know if there was anything in the law that like permitted that or like anything spoke to that. Mm-hmm. Oh, it was?
Yeah, there is.
Okay. So
I'm sure she didn't know though.
Yeah, I just read like
sure
marriage.
Ruth didn't know.
No, Ruth didn't know much about the law.
Yeah,
she didn't.
Yeah, but even still, like, just seeing the faith that that it took for him to trust the Lord and like and taking in a Moabite, and like, I don't know if everyone would have been in agreement with that or whatever, but
Yeah, I mean it is a beautiful picture, and we're gonna really speak about that more next time, because I just want to lay out and how we see, full on like the story of redemption, because obviously the scriptures is that's like the underlying theme of the whole scripture is the redemption of mankind, through Jesus Christ. So I didn't want to rush that because I think that's important, and we'll kind of draw that out more in our last study. Any other comments or questions? Yeah.
I was thinking about how Christ-like Naomi was being, in the sense, like, she knew she wasn't going to get married, she knew she wasn't going to have a child, but she really wanted that for Ruth. And she really went out of her way to serve Ruth in this way for her to be able to have a fruitful life, knowing that her life was coming to an end. She went out of her way that she might have life. And that's what Christ did for us. He went out of his way. He came down, he put his glory to the side, he gave his life, that he fulfilled the law on our behalf, that we might have life. In the same way, Naomi's kind of like really going out of her way, plotting, even like you said, for her to have a life, for her to have a husband, for her to have a child. And look how God honors Ruth in this, that Christ is going to come through Ruth now. Look at that honor that God gave her, It's amazing.
Yeah, and what's also like amazing is that she didn't think that this was going to happen. Like, there was no way like she could see it, because she was trying to get Ruth and Orpah to just stay back in the land of Moab, because I guess of her situation.
She thought it was better.
Yeah, it was better for them. You know, she in no way saw the blessings, and it's the same with us. Like we really don't see like the blessing that God is, the blessings that God is gonna lavish on us or pour down on us. And I think that's where like trusting is. You know, like we get to enjoy those blessings much more when we place our trust in Christ and then see all of that come to fruition.
Mm-hmm.
You know. But it's also a blessing when we lack faith, and God gives us faith, and then we look back and we see, wow, I lacked faith, but God was still good, even you know, even despite my lack of faith, and that's what we're seeing here. So I'm gonna close this out.